The 2080 Ti is a big step up from the 1080 Ti, but what does it mean for PUBG? Today we're going to check out the performance difference between these two cards so that you know what it can do and what it can't do in 4K, 1440p and 1080p. This review between these two cards is made by a gamer and it's meant for a fellow gamer. This is you, by the way. In other words, I won't show you any of those fancy benchmark tools and so on. What matters for gamers are the frames per second. This is something that we know and understand, and this is something that can mean the difference between life and death. The CPU that I'm using is an Intel i7 6900K and the graphics cards are an Asus Dual RTX 2080 Ti and an Asus ROG Strix 1080 Ti. In the top left corner you will see the GeForce Experience FPS overlay. In the top right corner you will see the Steam FPS overlay. Most of us use OBS to record or to stream our gameplay to Twitch, and that is also what I use to record this performance test of PUBG. OBS has a significant impact on the frames per second. With the 1080 Ti, this impact costed about 10 frames per second, and on the 2080 Ti, this impact was about 6 frames per second in 4K. I even used display capture. This has an even bigger impact on your system compared to the game capture. That way I can show you the worst case scenario. I did overclock both of my graphics cards using Asus GPU Tweak 2. I just selected the OC mode, nothing more. So this is something that you can easily replicate on your own PC if you have the same cards. For all of these tests, I used the Ultra Overall Quality settings. The field of view is 103 and the display mode is full screen windowed. The only thing that I will change, and I will show you that on screen, is the resolution. Let's start off with our running test in the new training mode. In 4K, with the 1080 Ti, we get an average of 50 frames per second. Not bad for a game like this, but if it's less than 60 frames per second, then well, it's not really all that great. Keep in mind that everything is set to Ultra. If we then swap our cards and we use the 2080 Ti, then you will get an average of 67 frames per second. This is 17 frames more than the 1080 Ti. There is a catch here. Remember that I told you that there is a cost that comes with recording with OBS. For example, before I started the recording with a 1080 Ti, I saw 60 frames per second instead of 50 that you're seeing right now. So 4K gaming with a 1080 Ti in PUBG is possible, because you will start off with 60 frames per second. You will notice a big difference when you play on a 1440p monitor instead of a 4K monitor. Now you will get 92 frames per second. This is a major step up from the 50 frames per second in 4K. 90 frames per second is great. Everything runs smoother and it is much easier to track your enemies. But we can do even better than that with the new 2080 Ti. This card will give you an average of 122 frames per second in our running test. 30 frames more than the 1080 Ti. Pretty impressive. This is the exact number of frames per second when you play PUBG in 1080p with the 1080 Ti. In other words, the new 2080 Ti will give you the same amount of frames at a higher resolution. This is probably the best way to remember the difference. So, the 1080 Ti in 1080p has the same frames per second as the 2080 Ti in 1440p. That is why this new graphics card is so great. It allows you to play in a higher resolution. If we then do our running test in 1080p with the 2080 Ti, then you will get an average of 140 frames per second, about 18 frames more compared to the 1080 Ti. One of the most taxing things that you can do in PUBG is to play in one of the bigger cities, for example in Yasnaya Polyana. If you stand on top of one of the rooftops and you look at the city, then your frames will drop all the way down to 45 frames per second with the 1080 Ti in 4K. If you then stand on top of the same rooftop, but you look towards the east, then you will get about 50 frames per second. This doesn't seem like a lot, but it's still in 4K. The difference becomes a lot bigger when you play in 1440p or in 1080p. With the 2080 Ti, you will get about 15 to 20 frames more when you stand on top of the same rooftop, depending on whether you're looking towards the city or away from it. Every test that I did with the 2080 Ti in 4K resulted in the same difference, about 15 to 20 frames more every single time. In 1440p, looking towards the city will give you 75 frames compared to 88 with the new card. Looking away from the city gives you 94 frames per second compared to 125. So the difference between the cards in terms of FPS lies between 13 and 30, depending on how taxing the view is that you're looking at. This number was consistent in all other tests that I did. The difference becomes even bigger in 1080p. Looking towards the city gives you 86 frames per second, and looking away from the city gives you 130 frames per second. This is quite a lot. It shows how much performance it takes to look at Yasnaya Polyana or to look away from it. With the 2080 Ti, these numbers will become 92 frames per second, only a 6 FPS improvement and 144 frames per second, maxing out my monitor, meaning that this number can be even higher than 144. The performance gain of the new card in 1080p lies between 6 and a number that is equal or higher than 14 frames per second. The moral of the story here is pretty simple. The new 2080 Ti was made to play your favorite games at a higher resolution. The performance gain in 1080p is much lower than the gain in 1440p, and it is slightly lower than the gain that you will get in 4K. While I was doing all of these tests to see what the difference between these cards really is, I just discovered that we can now play PUBG in 4K with 144 frames per second. Yes, you heard this right, 4K 144 FPS in PUBG. This is probably the ultimate gaming experience, and I will show you how we can do that in the next video. If you want to get your hands on the Asus RTX 2080 Ti, then use the link in the video description. This was the cheapest price that I could find for you. Make sure to like and subscribe if you haven't done so already, and make sure that you check out that 4K 144 FPS video.